Would you rather have had the song shorter or longer? Or do you feel like this is the appropriate length for this type of music and this topic?
For this particular song as it is, I think it's very nicely balanced exactly how it is. There's enough content, enough variety. I like the length. I could imagine it being developed further and perhaps becoming more
A second movement?
a second movement or maybe a more orchestral symphonic presentation of it, but it would have to change a bit to hold up to that. And I wouldn't really go with shortening it because you'd lose a lot of what it has already. Hi everyone. This is the in-depth follow-up portion to my first listen of the band Genesis, and the first piece I listened to by that band was Firth of Fifth. So I am going to be talking about Firth of Fifth today and the things that I've discovered and enjoyed about it as I dug into the music a bit more. Now, one of the things you may have noticed about my first listen, which if you haven't heard, you should listen to, is the fact that I really enjoyed a lot of the subtleties and sound worlds of the music and the dynamism of the piece. And so I spent some time digging into that some more. And I was curious to find out, how did they come up with this? It wasn't really surprising to me when I found out that the keyboardist of the band, Tony Banks, was actually highly involved with classical music. He had a classical music upbringing. His mother was a pianist. His two favorite composers during his childhood student years were Rachmaninoff and Ravel. Now, already we see that he's stepping outside of, the stereotypical, just the most famous composers, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, etc. He already, as a young person, has developed this familiarity and attraction to classical music that is more than just the basic familiarity. Rachmaninoff and Ravel. And it turns out that he even liked to pick out and learn to play pieces by those composers outside of his lessons, not assigned by his teachers. And along the way, he also got into Rodgers and Hammerstein, which is more of a lighter style, but also very classically influenced. And it did not surprise me that later, as his career developed, he was not only the keyboardist of Genesis, but he went on afterwards, and he is known as a composer of not just progressive rock music, but also film scores and modern classical music. So he has quite a colorful, rich musical taste and music career as his life. Now, of course, Tony Banks is not the only member of this band, but it turns out that this particular song, Firth of Fifth, the bulk of the material was first put together by Tony Banks. The whole band is credited with creating the music, and they all contributed, but Tony Banks was a big feature a big element in getting this all to come together and creating this piece of music. So I found that interesting, and I enjoyed discovering that background of the band members, and it helped me to understand why this piece has so much, I don't like to use the word sophistication, but at the same time, it is very highly developed in ways that a lot of the rock music I've listened to hasn't been. There's more polish, there's more continuity, there's more development in the music that is evidenced not just by listening, but by studying it. And as we go into this music, I also want to, before getting away from this Tony Banks part of the music, I also found out that he cites Mahler and Shostakovich and Satie as having significant impacts on him as a musician, as a composer. And some of his favorite pieces are symphonies by Sibelius and Vaughan Williams. And I looked up online and found him even naming some of his favorites, and I listened to them, and I was astonished at how non-rock his favorite pieces of music are. They're very much, his tastes are very much tending towards late romantic composers and impressionistic style composers. And that shows up in this music here, Firth of Fifth, and his compositional style. Even here, as he was still not deeply into his, decades into his music career, but as he was when he was part of this band. And I found that fascinating. And if you want to get into some of that classical music and explore where his influences came from, I'm going to include some links along the way as we go through this discussion, because I think you'll enjoy finding the connections and trying to pick out with your ears, how did that piece of music that he loves, or that composer that was a big influence on him, how does that relate to this Firth of Fifth? One of the things that I loved about this piece was the way it started, with this incredibly alive piano solo. And as I was researching, I discovered that it was performed on an honest-to-goodness, real, true acoustic grand piano. And there's a reason for that. This kind of music doesn't do well on electronic instruments. And when they performed this piece live, they usually cut this entire opening piano section from their performances because they couldn't haul a grand piano around with them on their tours, and it simply didn't sound good on an electric keyboard. And Tony Banks said, I can't do it. It makes no sense to do it unless I do it on a real grand piano. So in the recording, we're hearing a true concert grand piano, acoustic, and it sounds fabulous. I loved it. I loved the tone quality of it, of course, and I loved the style of it. I also enjoy the fact that, okay, if you've been following my journey, I have been learning to appreciate these modern instruments like electric guitar and synthesizer and drums and all of those things. But it's been a challenge, and it's been something that it takes me time to grow into. And I have had discussions with rock musicians along the way, and you've seen some of those on my channel, where I'm saying I struggle to relate to this sound, even on the synthesizer. They say you can do so many wonderful things, and you can make it sound like a real piano, and at the same time I'm thinking, but it doesn't give me the same end result as a piano that I love. And here I find a rock musician choosing a real grand piano for a specific purpose, to get the sound that he wanted, that he loves for that part. And I found that really personally satisfying, to finally find somebody in the rock music world who understood what it is that I hear in an acoustic grand piano that is lacking in an electronic instrument. And by saying this, I'm not saying that the synthesizer is no good. I'm just saying they are two different instruments, completely different instruments. They both have keys. The keys look pretty much the same, but the sound is different. And I love the fact that somebody in the rock music world recognized that they were two distinct differences, and that the grand piano has some irreplaceable qualities which can't be, or haven't yet been, reproduced by an electronic instrument. Now, getting more specific to this Firth of Fifth, I was intrigued by the name. And so I wanted to find out if that had any background history. Turns out there's a river, Forth, in Scotland. Now, you might remember when I was listening to this music, there were places where I said it sounds like it's tending towards a portrayal of a region or a folk style, village songs. And I think I mentioned Scotland. I know I mentioned Ireland a few times as well. There is a river Forth in Scotland, and a firth is a narrow opening or inlet. And there is actually an estuary called Firth of Forth in Scotland. So Firth of Fifth is a sort of play of words on this idea. And I don't know how they came up with it, but it's kind of fun. It sounds good. And it also gives us right away this idea that this music is somehow linked to a particular part of the world. Of course, as I said in my first listen experience, it's not trying to imitate and recreate the music of that part of the world. It's not trying to recreate Scottish folk music, Scottish traditional music. Not at all. In fact, the style of writing is what we might term impressionistic style of harmonic writing. And this style developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, early part of the 20th century was kind of the heyday, where it developed primarily in France before traveling around the classical world and expanding and enriching our musical language. And the intriguing thing about this style of harmonic writing is that it doesn't follow what we might call the norms of harmonic progression and relationships that we find in earlier classical music, as well as in the bulk of modern, contemporary, popular, and folk music. Because those types of music, classical music developed this harmonic language to its absolute height that it could go. Whereas folk and popular music uses it because it works so well for the simple song style. And when I say the norms of harmonic progression, I am speaking of the way in which chords and harmonies relate to one another. So you've heard me mention many times in my videos on my channel things like the 1 chord, the 5 chord, the hum and the pull of the dominant, and the way that they relate and complement and compete with each other. And of course, all the other chords beyond that, within that system. But impressionistic style harmonic writing goes outside. It kind of breaks down some of the walls around that, goes outside and brings in some other ways of thinking about chords. And I want to show you some of those today. Now, I'm going to do it in a way that I hope that every single one of you can enjoy without feeling like you're in a college composition course. However, if you are interested in really digging in and understanding more and more of this musical content, you're welcome to check out my Ko-fi and Patreon pages. I am running a course on music theory, starting at ground zero and working our way up until we get to this type of harmonic study and composition and stuff like that. So if you're interested, check it out. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy what I'm going to show you here. Now, just like Impressionistic painters were able to create works of art, works of visual art that gave us this impression of a world, of an environment, of a life in this new way artistically. So with Impressionist music. And just like with the painters and the paintings that we look at, where water is such a feature, we find that featured a lot in Impressionist style music as well. Because this whole harmonic approach lends itself beautifully to creating a sense of being in this watery world, or portraying and conveying the sound, the sensations around something fluid and not easily contained, defined, outlined, like water. And so we find a lot of water-themed music in the Impressionistic era and style. Of course, with all other kinds of music themes as well. It's not just water. But this piece, Firth of Fifth, uses the Impressionistic and chromatic compositional styles very well, and I think it does very nicely fit its watery theme, because that's what this whole piece of music is circling around. These styles of music incorporate other means than just the standard 1, 4, and 5 relationships and the other chord relationships within a scale, within a key, and how we move traditionally, how we transition outside of that key. In Impressionistic music, we tend to use more diminished chords and other, we could even say almost undefinable chords, because we don't think of them so much as chords anymore. We think of them as collections of notes that create a sound quality, a sound color. And there is sense and logic behind all of it, but we have to think about it a little bit differently than we think about our normal progressions of going from 1 to a 5 and having all of the ideas of conflict and resolution and all of that we become accustomed to thinking of in that style of music. So one of the things that makes this kind of music, this kind of harmonic progression work and make sense is how one chord, one set of notes, can relate to the next in a way that doesn't have so much to do with a certain order or sequence of chords. It has more to do with how we might link and relate one to the next in a different way. And I'm going to call it common tones. In other words, I'm playing a simple C chord right now, C, E, G. And I am going to use this E as my common tone. And I'm now going to move outside of the key center of C. One little shift. I will move this note down. I will move this note up. And I've moved to a different harmonic sound world, which is still essentially an E major chord, but we don't have E major in the key of C, do we? So listen how smooth the transition is. It's easy. It moves nice, subtly, just a little harmonic shift, just a couple notes scooting sideways, and I have this note in the middle remaining as a commonality between the two. When we have commonality from one chord to the next, it becomes smooth, effortless, and non-jarring in its transitional feel. Even if it might not, doesn't mean it always doesn't, but it may not make sense according to our normal concepts of how chords ought to move. And here's an example, which I pulled from the music itself. It's towards the end of the piano solo opening. And I picked it out because it's such a great compact example of all of this. I want to show you what's happening here. So we're starting with this as our main color that we've got going. And then it goes to here. You see how many of those notes have remained the same. We're back to where we started. We go here. Now we go here. Now notice that this is going to remain a common tone as I go to here. And then I go through this. Now this is going to remain a common tone as I go to here. And then I end up here. Well, that is quite a different place to end up than where I started. And it could end up being very chaotic or disjointed sounding, but because of the way each chord was linked to another or was not far away from another, then it had this very smooth transitional feel. At the same time, a lot of coloring and different qualities we heard in there. And as you're listening to this opening dynamic piano solo and all the shifts and colorations that are happening, not just rhythmically, because remember, it is a very rhythmically dynamic opening as well. We also have this harmonic element, which makes it so incredibly fabulous. And this harmonic element remains very much working in the same way throughout the entire piece of music. There are a couple places where it simplifies into our more standard chord relationships for a very good reason, and I'll get to that shortly. Now, being that Ravel, we know, was one of Banks's great influences, I wanted to give you a link to something by Ravel, in which you might hear some of the same qualities of very smooth transitions, like I was just talking about harmonically in Firth the Fifth. Now, I also want to use this chance to tell a little bit about Ravel. Ravel is a name you probably know if you've listened to much classical music, because he wrote a piece of music called Bolero, which became very famous. And there's a funny story about this. Ravel really didn't like Bolero. Ravel really wrote Bolero as a sort of exercise and to give himself something to do one summer, because that summer he had planned to work on something else. And he was really looking forward to it, and then discovered that it had already been done by somebody else. So he had to give up that project that he was eager to do, and after a few weeks, he wrote a letter to somebody saying, I'm working on something which is very different, and it has almost no musical development, no harmonic development. It's a unique thing. He did it as a sort of exercise in orchestration, and that's how we ended up with the Bolero, which, I will say, is a very fine work. But Ravel hated it, and he was astonished at how it became so popular. In fact, at the premiere, his brother told him that when the piece finished, this old woman stood up and was yelling, "Rubbish, rubbish, rubbish," about the Bolero. And Ravel said, she got the point. And later in his life, he was with somebody else, and this friend said, "Do you want to go try our hand at gambling together?" And Ravel said, "Nope, I did it with Bolero and I won. I'm not going to try my luck again." And another time he commented saying, "I have written one masterpiece and it has not a single note of music in it." So it's kind of entertaining to me to, and to anybody who really knows Ravel's music, to recognize that this piece is so famous, so well received, and yet most of his other more highly developed music isn't quite so well known in the popular consciousness. So here I'm going to share with you a link to a particular piece of piano music, which translated into English is called Treasurer of the Night. It's in 3 movements, and it's based on poems. It starts with a very fluid, watery movement, and I've chosen this because of the watery elements, because it links to Firth of Fifth, telling about a seductive water fairy. The next movement is a somber movement about a desert scene with a hanged man still hanging, and in which you can hear a constant bell tolling. If you listen to the recording, you will hear it in the piano, this constant tolling bell throughout the entire second movement. The final movement is wild and full of mischief, and it's portraying a little fiendish goblin going about all of his nighttime tricks and activities. So it's a really fun piece of music if you're interested in exposing yourself to a bit more of what Firth of Fifth might have been inspired by, certainly was influenced by this composer. While we're in the zone of listening to some of these other composers, there's also Satie, who was also one of Tony Banks's inspirations. Now, many of you have heard some of Satie's music. There are a couple of Satie's pieces which are very famous again. I'm going to give you a link to one which is fairly well known, but perhaps not the most common one. And I think it's absolutely charming. In the same vein, Firth of Fifth also reminds me of another piece of music, which I didn't find referenced in anything relating to the song, and the composer didn't come up in what I read about Tony Banks. But the style of Firth of Fifth is very much, to me, it feels like it's a piece of music telling a story and following a river. There's another famous piece of music which does that, and we know it commonly in English as The Moldau by Smetana. Here's a link. And it starts, you'll hear 2 little flutes, and they are portraying the 2 streams which begin the river. Eventually they join, and then it follows the journey of the river past villages. You hear a village dance, you hear as it gets to the big city, you hear it going past these different places, and it's a wonderful symphonic poem, and it features harp in it. So it's one that I've played in, and I love it, and I think that you might be able to feel some similarities between Firth of Fifth and the Moldau as well. Another composer who was an influence for Tony Banks was Bartók. I've mentioned Bartók in some other videos as well, because he was a 20th century composer who really experimented with rhythms and rhythmic complexities, changes of time signatures in a way that we didn't see back in the 1800s by any means. And his music is full of surprises, and I have discovered that a lot of rock music that is more pushing towards the rhythmic experimentalism finds a lot of inspiration in Bartók. This piano opening that Tony Banks plays has some Bartók elements in it as well, rhythmically. But also, As I was getting familiar with this piece of music, I really, even in the first listen, the guitar solo. But the more I listened, the more I got to enjoy this guitar solo, and I'm going to talk about it some. But as I'm talking about composers and influences and all of that, I want to mention a certain piece of music by Bartók, which there are parts of it which I am reminded of when I listen to the guitar solo. It is commonly known in English as An Evening in the Village or An Evening in Transylvania. And it was originally a little piano piece, kind of mid-student level. And then along the way, it became orchestrated. I'm going to give you the orchestrated version here, because as I was listening, I began to think of this piece of music and the way he exploits the expressive qualities of each note. And I began to feel like this Bartók piece would be fabulous, played on guitar, in the same style as Steve Hackett plays the guitar solo of Firth of Fifth. Imagine it, listen to it, and try to imagine what it would sound like if Steve Hackett were playing this Evening in the Village. Maybe even stretching out some of those long notes super, super long, like we hear in Firth of Fifth's guitar solo. I think it would sound amazing. And it was fun for me to notice myself relating a classical piece of music to an electric guitar. You've heard me in previous videos and first listens beginning to say, okay, I can imagine this guitar solo being played by a saxophone, by a clarinet, by a cello. But I guess this is the first time that I thought of a classical piece that I think would sound incredible on electric guitar. And I wanted to share that with you because I'm trying to share every step of my journey as I become comfortable with these sounds and instruments that I'm exposing myself to. If there's any guitarist out there who wants to try this, let me know. I'll be happy to provide you with the piano sheet music so that you can work off of it if you please, or if you prefer to do it by ear, you can follow the recording. But this is an idea that came to me as I was listening, and I had a lot of fun thinking about it, and I would enjoy hearing somebody give it a shot. Speaking of the way in which this piece of music transitions and has so much variety and richness without being jarring and abrupt for the listener. Another feature, other than the harmonic design, is also the way that every new element is sort of prepared in advance for you, so that when it comes, it feels familiar. A great example of this is the guitar solo, which is prepared in advance by the flute, so that when this guitar solo comes in, even though it's our first exposure to this solo, at the same time, there's a subconscious familiarity with it, because we have heard it before in the flute in a more orchestral setting. You'll recognize it. Here's where the flutes, this is the flute part itself. And then it climbs up the scale, and I'll tell you what comes next in a moment. But that is the primary melodic content of the guitar solo. And we first heard it with the flute. That's not the end of this little preparation. The next thing we hear after it climbs up this scale is double time. Well, I've discovered that drummers call it half time. But essentially, the tempo is increased twice as much. So what we just heard not too long ago now we hear it as, and it has a different dynamic quality to it, as well as reinforcing that same melody, even though it feels like something new. Then we hear, later in the song, the guitar solo. And at first, we might not pick it up instantly, because of course the guitarist is now taking it as an improvisatory, free, melodic idea, which he develops in his own style. But if you listen closely, you will hear that same melody. Not only later in the solo when it shows up more like we heard with the flute, but also at the beginning, some of those long notes. And in fact, I read that Steve Hackett tried to visualize a bird hovering high above the ocean when originally creating this solo. It is one of the places in which the music is built on something that came before, and yet we hear it fresh because it is now treated as material to manipulate rather than something that should be played according to a certain measured quality. This guitar solo is also one of the places in the music that relies on very simple, standard type harmonic progressions, unlike the other parts of the music that were being more chromatic and different types of relationships as I was talking about. Now, in this solo, we have something that is much more akin to folk music. And I think that is highly appropriate because this is one of the places in the music where we feel like it's really evoking this connection to the Scottish scenery, this river, this imaginary Firth river, and all that is going along with these connections. And we're essentially working in our E minor key. Sometimes we hear an A minor chord, and then it goes back to E minor. A minor would be the 4. Then it moves to B minor, which is the 5. Then we're back to E minor. We're just playing with these 1, 4, and 5 chords. Very basic, very simple, and eventually we end on B major. And it gives this wonderful implication, illusion of we are watching a native scene. We are observing the river as it flows, the scenery along the side, this whole thing, and it feels very natural, very simple, very much like folk style music. And it's appropriate because, again, like I was saying about the Moldau piece, when you're portraying the travel of something like a river through the different parts of the countryside, you want to bring in all these elements that help to create that entire picture. Now, about the lyrics, I found them interesting. At first I thought they were rather random. I tried to make sense of them, and then as I was beginning to think more about this as it relates to an impressionist style, I began to think they worked beautifully. They're certainly sticking with a water or river theme, but it seems like rather than trying to tell a complete story or make sense of a narrative, they're more working to evoke various imagery and impressions in our minds rather than trying to be compelling on their own. Works very well with the music. They become less a focal point of their own. Also, not particularly adding to the meaning of the song, although there are things you can certainly pull out of them. I don't mean that they're nonsensical, but I feel that they are treated more as another instrument, another element that is contributing to and enhancing with scenic suggestions the already existent romantic impressionistic qualities of the piece. Personally, I like to think of these lyrics as being another set of musical colors and imagery that is woven throughout the music itself. And that might be kind of a strange way of viewing it to some of you, which is okay. That's how I perceive it. That's how I relate to it. And I love what it does. If I am, again, going back to try to relate it to something visual, let's say an impressionistic style painting, let's say that some painter has created this work of art and has incorporated into the scene some words which maybe string together into sentences, maybe into a story, but paintings don't have that many words to read on them, right? You have to stick with the art. But the words bring to mind and enhance what we're seeing, and they help us to interpret what we're seeing visually. And I think it's the same way with these lyrics in this song. I think that they really help us to understand this music in its own special way. And I like it a lot. These are my thoughts after having spent several days with the music. I am very much looking forward to spending more time with more Genesis in the future. Those of you who have already written to me after my first listen saying there are at least 2 other songs I must do, yes, I'm going to be looking forward to those and doing those in the future. And for those of you who understand what I mean, yes, I'll see you next time.
So Amy, which one is your favorite? The piano opening or the guitar solo?
Oh, it's so hard to pick favorites. I guess in this case, if I really must pick a favorite, I'm going for the guitar solo.
Wow.